I thought a good subject to cover here is a very topical one. It's about power, accountability, and democracy. These three things, obviously, there's a lot of crossover among them. Um, it's been a very busy news week. A lot's happened. The Johnson resignation. We're now seeing a big heat wave in Europe. But there's two other events that come to mind related to the subject. One is the assassination of Shinzo Abe, and the other is this crisis in Sri Lanka. Now, I'm not going to talk about either event in detail, but they both come into this. Um, New information is emerging about the alleged assassin of Mr. Abe. Supposedly, the guy confessed, and he was angry because he saw Abe as responsible for his mother's financial ruin. Apparently, he associated Abe with a religious group. I believe it was a group of the Reverend Moon, which is a South Korean kind of religious cult. Whether Abe was connected to that or not, I don't know, but clearly this assassin thought so, and clearly he harbored a hatred of Abe as a result. Sri Lanka, incredible scenes from there. People storming the presidential palace. It's quite remarkable. People swimming in the presidential swimming pool, looking at the luxurious compound, paintings and so on. It's quite remarkable scenes. Um, but in that case, what we see is just this boiling over of public anger. It's certainly not the first time that's happened. Well, anywhere in the world. People Power in the Philippines, 1986. History has a strange way of turning around because now, of course, the dictator who was toppled in that revolution, his son is now in power in the Philippines. So history has a strange way of turning around. But in Sri Lanka, it looks like the end of the Rajapaksa dynasty. And one man was interviewed by the BBC, and the reporter was saying, "Is this the right way to go about it?" And he was saying, "Look, we've tried everything else. We've been calling on them to go, and they just corrupt as hell." I do feel if people feel that they're not empowered, then they feel there's no other choice. Now, I don't like mob rule. I think that it could be a dangerous thing, but a huge part of democracy. I mean, I'm talking about democracy here because in totalitarian single party states, it's not even relevant in the sense that it does not exist. The very principle of freedom doesn't exist. So it's like another world because the foundations aren't even there. But in let's say fledgling democracies or flawed democracies, where people generally do have more of a voice, at least more freedom of expression. Um, Ironically, there might actually be more anger because people are more informed, perhaps. I mean, in a country like China, when the ruling regime controls all information, when it controls all media networks, then it can control the narrative. So people have very, very little recourse to see other sources of information. That's not to say that there isn't anger in China, there is. I mean, what happened in Shanghai earlier this year, the forced lockdowns. There must be times in China when there is very deep public anger because they know that they've got no power. Indeed, the events of 1989 were very much about public anger against the ruling establishment. There was a lot of factors for that, but that was certainly one of them. I mean, against the established Communist Party, there were reformers like Hu Yaoping and Zhao Ziyang who the students favoured. And it wasn't just students, this is one of the misconceptions of those events of 1989. There was actually millions of ordinary Chinese, I mean, not political students, but just ordinary people who were fed up with a lot of things as well. Um, but these events in Sri Lanka are, I think, a timely sort of thing to look at. There may be more to say as things go on. I must admit, I'm not hugely familiar with Sri Lankan politics. I know the basic history, the civil war, and so on. But anyway, coming back to Britain, this issue of empowerment of the public is extremely important because even in a relatively stable country, i.e., a country that doesn't have political violence, which has peaceful transfers of power, you could still get a significant degree of anger. I'm thinking of, well, let's use three countries as an example: the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Now, all three countries have seen angry protests over numerous things. Um, America, of course, there was an incident on January the 6th, which I feel was, I certainly wouldn't want to attach that to the notion of people power because I think that was largely driven by Donald Trump's narcissism and QAnon conspiracy nonsense. But my point is, in democracies, you do, it's not like being a democracy isn't kind of a guarantor of public tranquility. France has seen very angry protests. Of course, Julie John's demonstrations, which kind of factored in both the left and the right. They were a bit hard to define. In Britain, we've seen plenty of the anti-vaccine stuff, and there's been other examples. But I feel passionate that people who are in a position of power have to be accountable. They have to be. And this isn't just politicians, that's a misconception. It's not just about governments and politicians. In fact, I would argue that politicians are probably more accountable than the other groups I'm going to name. Why? Because at least with politicians, you can vote them out of office. Now, maybe the public don't have a say on ministerial appointments. Maybe they don't have, we don't directly elect prime ministers, for example. So it's only Tory members will decide the next prime minister, and that certainly looks questionable. But the people do decide the government, the ruling government, in a general election. Now, the Tories won the most seats, therefore they have a right to govern. That's democracy. But my point is, if people are not happy with their MP, even right up to the Prime Minister could, in theory, lose their seat in a general election. So, in that sense, there's a degree of public empowerment with politics. People might say it's not enough, but I think there's a degree of it at least. I'm thinking more of other areas. I'm thinking especially the justice system. This is something I made no secret of. Utterly infuriates me. This week, Tracy Connolly, the mother of baby P, a so-called mother of baby P, she was responsible for one of the most heinous crimes in this country in recent years, where she, along with her partner, tortured her infant to death. Um, the neglect, the abuse, the torture caused that child to die, and she's been released. And this was a decision of the parole board. Dominic Raab, as Justice Secretary, has expressed his anger, um, and he has said that there should be ministerial power to block those decisions, which at the moment doesn't exist. Parole board and the sentencing council are two examples of the sort of empowerment I am talking about, because as far as the public is concerned, there is basically no accountability. Now, if you look at the websites of these bodies, and let's just briefly look at them, the Sentencing Council of England and Wales is the body primarily responsible for sentencing guidelines. So judges follow their guidelines. Although I still believe that some judges are inherently weak and will go on the lower end of the scale in terms of the criteria that they're looking at. So I don't agree that judges always have their hands tied. I think it's a collective arrogance with the legal establishment. I just don't think they really understand public anger on this. Um, so yeah, if you look at the sentencing council and you look at the parole board, the websites, they're they're very detailed in terms of self-congratulation and this is what we do and this is how we reach our decisions. But there really is very little public recourse. There is a postal address and there's emails and you can contact them and maybe get an answer. As an example of this, if the public feel that a sentence is unduly lenient, you can in theory write to the Attorney General, who's currently running for the position of Prime Minister, Joella Braverman. Now I'm not sure if she's still in that post or if she resigned, so I don't know what's going on with ministerial appointments at the moment, but in theory, what she can do is then write to the Court of Appeal to have that sentence overturned. But I recently raised this issue with, I think it was Mold Crown Court in Wales, because they came out with an insanely weak sentence. An armed burglar got 3 years, 3 years for holding a knife to a woman's throat. Anyway, they referred to the source that showed the number of cases that were appealed. In other words, a number of cases, what the offence was, what the original sentence was, and whether or not that sentence was increased. Now, the vast majority, nothing changed. In many cases, they weren't even referred to the Court of Appeal. Now, that to me demonstrates that the system is just out of touch. In other words, you had the public complaining about the leniency of these sentences, but nothing changed. So the sentencing council, the parole board, they know best. So I think for the public, especially victims of crime, there is a massive sense of a lack of empowerment. Some things have improved, and I do give Dominic Raab credit. I honestly do feel he's one of our better justice secretaries because he has been tougher, he has been more assertive than, for example, the likes of David Gowd. But I think this will take more than one justice secretary. I mean, for example, Raab introduced a victims bill, and he introduced a situation whereby victims of crime have more say in parole hearings. But I'm pretty sure the parole board would have put up barriers to that, and they only would have accepted it due to pressure from Mr. Raab eventually. Um, I do feel that there are legal bureaucrats who just don't understand public opinion. Now, Martin Jones, the CEO of the parole board, apparently has 30 years of experience working with victims of crime. How then does that correlate with him presiding over a body that continues to release violent people? It doesn't add up. Um, his last public statement was in April 2021. If you ask members of the public, what does the head of the sentencing council or the head of the parole board even look like? I suspect 99% of people wouldn't know. But that's significant because these people have power. They're weak where they don't need to be weak, but they have power nevertheless. Um, and other than writing angry emails or letters, what can the public do? It's utterly infuriating. There's other areas, the media. And I guess what's the recourse there? Well, we have the choice whether or not we buy newspapers, whether or not we watch the BBC or Sky News or GB News or whatever it is. So there's a degree of choice there. I still believe in too many areas of public life where power is involved. The public just doesn't have it. I favour much, much more public empowerment. Now, what I'm not calling for is mob justice. What I'm not calling for is saying everything should be determined by the rule of the mob. No, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that public anger needs to be respected and understood. Um, Judges, getting back to the justice system, judges are basically unaccountable. The only way a judge can be kind of reprimanded is for official misconduct. So, for example, if he is, it's mostly men, if he is presiding over a case and he has, sends flirty text messages to a juror, that would be professional misconduct. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about judges who are consistently soft. What can the public do about that? There was one judge who disgracefully suggested that a young woman who had been raped may have incited the rapist because of the way she dressed. And there was, understandably, public fury. He made a grovelling apology, but I say a judge like that should lose his job. I think these people should have their jobs on the line. Now, I'm not saying the job is easy, but I don't think that they face anywhere near the level of public scrutiny that they should for their decisions. And it's utterly infuriating. I would favour actually a more American style system. I'm not saying necessarily electing judges, although it's certainly something I'd be open minded to, but simply more empowerment. I mean, in the States, and believe me, I know there's plenty of problems with the American justice system. Plenty of problems. I think they lock up too many people for non-violent offences. But I do think there's more transparency with the American justice system, much more. I mean, maybe it's time that we look at the pros and cons of televised trials. I suppose the cons would be it could become sensationalized, like a sort of soap, and that shouldn't be the case when we're talking about justice. But so much in this country is basically done behind closed doors. I mean, yeah, there's a public gallery in judicial hearings, but again, high profile cases, I just think there is a lack of transparency. And I do feel the vast majority of the public do not feel empowered. I think the parole board should be forced to listen to the public. And I think if you have a case where a violent offender is released by their decision, goes out and assaults someone or kills someone or rapes someone, then heads should roll, metaphorically speaking, at the parole board. People should lose their jobs. Why is it any different than a government minister being involved in a scandal and losing his or her job, as they should? So, what I want to conclude with this is I mentioned Sri Lanka and Japan. Now, in Japan, what we saw was extreme political violence. We saw an assassination. In this country, mercifully, it's relatively rare, although we have had Sir David Amess and Joe Cox in recent years. Um, that sort of thing can never be justified. Violence and threats can't be justified because the problem is, if you justify it, then where do you draw a line? Then anyone can do whatever they want if they're angry about something, and that's basically anarchy. So that can never be justified. But I do insist that judges, newspaper editors, politicians, police chiefs, these people, and there's other examples I'm sure, have to be answerable to the public because they serve the public. At least they should. And certainly in some of those cases, I don't think that's the case. Um, so I'm a fierce advocate of public empowerment. I'm not talking about the rule of the mob. I'm simply talking about empowerment. I'm simply talking about letting the public have a much greater voice. And I think there's a lot more that could be done in this country. In the justice system, we see these trickle down improvements, but and I credit Dominic Raab for that. But I honestly believe this will take more than one justice secretary. It needs a radical overhaul. Basically, these faceless legal bureaucrats need a shake-up. When I say faceless, I mean the public don't know what they look like. They're just not accountable. And it is infuriating. Now, if they were high-profile figures, I think there'd be more of a domain for people to say, well, Mr. or Mrs., whatever their name is the CEO, they should resign. But to even have any recourse, it's almost like they deliberately put up barriers. It is infuriating. So, everyone has responsibility. As citizens, we have responsibility. I believe those in power. And actually, there's another category that I didn't mention. Um, Company managers. Okay, so the heads of the big supermarkets, um, the heads of companies. There's too many companies that have a total disregard for consumer opinion. And I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but that's another big area that I should have mentioned. Um, I mean, you deal with companies that they give these automated responses, despite lots of people complaining about the poor service. And there's no accountability. They're happy to take your money, but they won't. What's the service? It's just these automated dismissive replies. Um, I do strongly believe in consumer rights. I believe that consumers should have a greater voice. And I believe that companies, I'm not talking about government involvement necessarily, I think that they themselves should realize is bad business. But I think that some big companies kind of reckon, well, we're making millions. People will kind of just put up with this. I do think they've a bad attitude. I think a lot of certainly the railway companies have a bad attitude the long suffering public. Um, all of these things combined just leaves people feeling utterly disillusioned, stressed, some degree of anxiety. So I'm passionate advocate for much, much greater public empowerment, consumer empowerment, citizen empowerment. And I know none of this will change overnight, but it has to change. Let me know your thoughts.